Welcome to the Friday panel series of the International Writing Program's 2025 Fall Residency. For those of you who are new to our programming, we've given our writers a topic to consider and present to you today. To learn about this year's cohort of writers, visit iwp.uiowa.edu, where you will find their biographies and writing samples, as well as a schedule of our upcoming events. There is also pizza in the back of the room for those in physical attendance here today, and that's graciously provided by the international programs at the University of Iowa. And now for today's panel, Reflections on Trauma in Writing. Many of this year's Fall Residency participants have experienced monumental historical shifts in their home countries throughout their lifetime. Can one writer truly express the collective trauma of an entire country? These essays reflect personal journeys of generational and experienced trauma and how writing has aided them in processing their experiences. Our format for every panel is the same. I introduce the writers, going down the list. They'll each give a brief presentation, and then we'll open it up to questions. Lindsay Reynolds will be wandering around with the microphone. Please don't begin answering your question until she reaches you with that microphone, because we want to be sure that the audience watching on YouTube can hear you. Immediately to my left is Yulia Musakovska, who is a poet, writer, and translator from Ukraine. She's the author of 6 poetry collections, including most recently an English translation, The God of Freedom, published by Aerosmith Press and shortlisted for the Lviv UNESCO City of Literature Prize, and named one of the 10 best Ukraine-related books by the Kyiv Independent. Her work has been translated into over 30 languages and published in particular in the Southern Review, Tupelo Quarterly, The Common, Agni, and The Continental. A recipient of numerous Ukrainian literary awards, she is also a frequent speaker at international events and a dedicated cultural advocate for Ukraine. Her latest collection, Stones and Nails, captures how a poet's voice breaks through numbness to record and process the unimaginable realities of war. She is now working on her first book of prose, and her participation in the Fall Residency is made possible thanks to the University of Iowa's Office of the Vice President for Research, the Graduate College, with additional support from Razom for Ukraine. To Yulia's left is Vlora Konashevci, a poet, translator, and essayist from Kosovo. She's the author of the poetry collection Lav Divetis and the editor-translator of the bilingual anthologies Poetry Without Borders and Magma. Her poetry and translations appear in the Common Sense, Songs of Eretz, and European Literature Network. A winner of multiple literary awards and a contributor to Kosovo's cultural press, she also works as a certified translator for national and international institutions. Her participation is made possible thanks to the University of Iowa's Office for the Vice President for Research and the Graduate College. And finally, Abubakar Adam Ibrahim, fiction writer, scholar, and journalist from Nigeria. He's the author of 4 books. His first novel, Season of Crimson Blossoms, won the $100,000 NLNG Nigeria Prize for Literature in 2016. His second novel, When Were Fireflies, was longlisted for the Dublin Literary Award in 2024. He's also the author of a collection of interconnected short stories, Dreams and Assorted Nightmares, and The Whispering Trees, which was shortlisted for the Caine Prize for African Writing. He received the Michael Elliott Award for Excellence in African Storytelling for his reportage on female victims of Boko Haram, and he has just finished work on his 5th book, a novel that explores the shameful legacies of Nigeria's last dictatorship in the life of a family. He's working on his dissertation on disinformation, power, and media culture in Nigeria. Please join me in welcoming Yulia.
Good afternoon, and this is Writing Trauma from Within the Trauma. Speaking of war, nothing can prepare you for a full-scale war against your homeland. Neither knowledge of history or the aggressor's unpunished invasions, nor clear political forecasts, nor even the bad premonition that has been gnawing at you for so long. Your first reaction is shock, followed by numbness, and then a rapid grasp for survival. Equipping your air raid shelter, helping friends evacuate from the most dangerous areas, ensuring those who cannot leave have essential supplies, and assisting Army volunteers in getting the ammunition they need. If you're a writer, language is your most familiar weapon. But in times like these, it breaks into countless sharp fragments. You must gather them, wounding yourself in the process, piece them together, and learn to speak anew. You might no longer believe in the power of words, but your vitality depends on them. I know this. A writer writes to breathe. At least a poet does. And one must be heard to be helped. The duty of a writer. But what gives you the right to speak for an entire country? Is it when you bury a longtime friend killed in action, the same friend you had hosted at your New Year's party, drinking champagne together only months before? Or when a murdered colleague's striking resemblance in a funeral photograph makes you feel as though it is you lying in that closed coffin? Is it when you clutch your child trying to shield him with your body while explosions thunder outside? How much suffering is enough to legitimize your words? I recall the first weeks of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine when I was turning down invitations for speaking engagements abroad. I felt I was in no position to represent my people, those who had been forced to flee their homes or had survived occupation seemed more deserving to be that voice. Living in a city far from Russia's borders, where missiles and drones rarely reached, made me painfully conscious of my relative safety, stirring both doubt and guilt. And still, remaining silent felt even more impossible. After a panel discussion and poetry performance in Vilnius, which I had reluctantly agreed to, a displaced Ukrainian woman approached me and said, "You speak for all of us. We can't find the words or the strength to do this. You are more resourceful." That moment made me realize I had a duty to continue. In truth, a writer has no right to speak on behalf of others. However, they are somehow perceived as if they do, both as a figure of integrity at home and a representative of their country abroad. A writer is never a solitary voice. Like a drop in the ocean, a phrase that became a slogan during the 2014 Revolution of Dignity in Ukraine. One drop can embody the strength of the whole. An artist, and a poet even more so, as a person of deep empathy, cannot remain indifferent to the suffering of their nation. The need for creative response is often both healing and destructive. The artist and servicewoman Margarita Polovinko used her own blood as paint in her wartime works. So profound was the pain she felt for her country. She was 31 when she was killed in battle. As artists, we transform our agony into testimony so that the aggressor can never rewrite history again. The unforgotten traumas of ancestors. Although no one wants to be defined by trauma, in many ways we are shaped by it. The Bosnian poet Adisa Basic writes about her trauma with bitter irony. That's the only valuable thing I have. We have yet to process the traumas of previous generations. And now, as Ukrainians, we carry our own, brand new and shiny. Our parents were often unwilling to speak of their traumas, fearing this knowledge might hurt us. Instead, they left them to us like family jewels, carefully locked away in boxes. My grandmother, an ethnic Ukrainian, was deported together with her parents and siblings from their village in Poland at the end of World War II, during an exchange of populations initiated by the Soviet Union. The regime believed a mono-ethnic majority would be easier to control. My grandmother's family was loaded onto a cargo train with minimal possessions and sent into the unknown, the Chernobyl region in Ukraine. Uprooted, they had to start anew. While my great-grandfather was forcibly drafted into the Red Army, he returned with typhus, which soon claimed his life. My great-grandmother became a young widow with 2 children, struggling to make ends meet. My grandmother never spoke of the deportation. I learned about it from my mother and aunt. In her 20s, my grandmother met my grandfather, an Armenian who had survived both the war and service in the Red Army. But his relationship with his conservative mother did not survive his marriage to a Ukrainian. His family carried trauma of their own. They came from Nagorno-Karabakh, a region in Azerbaijan mostly populated by Armenians, long marked by disputes. It's called Artsakh in Armenian. Seeking a better life, they moved to the capital, Baku. To do so, they had to change their last name to Azerbaijani, adding a Russian ending to conform to Soviet policy of Russification. Only in Ukraine, my grandfather finally felt at home. And he spoke of these events only briefly toward the end of his life. My father carried his own trauma. I always sensed he was hiding something. The arguments between my parents behind closed doors, the swiftly changed topic whenever I entered the room. In the 1970s, he was confined to a mental hospital, a Soviet tactic of repression, supposedly meant to cure young people drawn to Western culture. Those who, like my father, learned foreign languages, read Allen Ginsberg and Lawrence Ferlinghetti, or listened to the Beatles and the Rolling Stones. Tasting the forbidden fruit could bring severe punishment. The treatment was torture through heavy medication and electroshock, intended to break one's spirit and damage health, sometimes irreversibly. Unlike some friends, my father recovered, but was unable to complete his university education. He had to take a factory job. He shared his story with me only during his struggle with cancer. He believed it might be his last chance. At first, he forbade me to speak of it publicly. I wove it into some poems in my collection, The God of Freedom. Thankfully, poetry allows us to conceal and reveal as much as we choose. These individual tragedies reflect broader historical patterns. The Soviet occupation now seeks to return to Ukraine as a Russian neo-empire, waging a genocidal full-scale war in its 4th year. Torture, kidnapping, deportation, forced mobilization, and Russification are reported all across the occupied territories. According to the UN, over 95% of Ukrainians released from Russian captivity report having been tortured. By drawing on their own experience, writers tell their nation's story, offering accounts that readers trust above all. Russia's war against Ukraine seeks to erase our identity, dignity, and freedom, silencing our voices. Writing itself becomes a form of resistance, a way to affirm truth and presence. Confronting the trauma. My generation of Ukrainians strives to confront our trauma. We attend therapy, take prescribed antidepressants, and work to raise our children in a spirit of trust and calm, despite the harsh realities of wartime. Our children, in turn, face their own traumas, becoming children of war, just like our grandparents were. Though the senseless guilt of not protecting my son from this experience is always there, I can still help him build resilience. I do not know what he will remember. Probably the frantic runs to the shelter in the middle of the night, the whistling of drones flying dangerously close, followed by the gunfire of our air defense. My tears at the border with Poland in the freezing March of 2022. A girl evacuated from a frontline city in his class, often screaming and knocking things from her desk. I hope he remembers how we read books aloud and sang songs during electricity cutoffs. At times, I wonder if I should encourage him to write down these memories so they do not haunt him later. Perhaps this too will become part of our nation's story. As Ukrainian writers, we carry the trauma of massive physical and cultural erasure, the early loss of those who came before us, the victims of the 1930s executed Renaissance, the dissidents later persecuted under the Soviet regime. The silencing of Ukrainian voices is ongoing. Whose working title and biography are now crammed onto a grave marker? Asked the poet and soldier Artur Dronь in his poem Ukrainian Literature. He refers to the new executed Renaissance, which since 2014 counts hundreds of cultural figures, documented cases only. These were our colleagues and friends. As writers, we carry the trauma inflicted on the Ukrainian language itself, systematically suppressed and banned over 400 years under the Russian Empire and Soviet occupation. Putin and his propagandists absurdly claim it is a distorted form of Russian, even though Moscow was founded 7 centuries after Kiev. To write in Ukrainian is to preserve this beautiful, endangered language, to continue its rich literary tradition, and to defy the aggressor. Facing the unthinkable. A writer turns to writing to comprehend the unthinkable, yet Russia's war in Ukraine is not over, and the unthinkable repeats, testing the limits of human endurance. My latest Ukrainian collection, Stones and Nails, features poems from the first 2 years of the full-scale invasion. The poems speak of the occupiers' war crimes, destruction, and suffering, but also of the love and resilience of my nation. The book is modest in size, and these days I write even less poetry. Some ask me why. Writing about trauma as it is inflicted again and again can feel like echoing the same words. the sharp edges blur and the intensity flattens. I was once optimistic about the power of literature, believing it could awaken nations and move people to action. Now I realize we are largely alone in this war for our nation's survival, even as Ukraine defends global democracy against the growing axis of evil. This realization comes as another heavy trauma to process. In this solitude, writing may seem a desperate quest for justice. Still, surrender is not an option, and neither is silence. Thank you.
Good afternoon. It's not easy speaking after Yulia. The ground I write from. I'm sorry. War splits time. There's before, there's an after. You don't always notice when the break happens. It can feel slow, like something slipping just out of view, but later it shows us itself, in memory, in dreams, in language. The things you thought were gone begin to rise. And this I know. All these things, while we are still in the war, sink down in us like a stone. After the war shall awaken again, and then shall begin the disentanglement of life and death. Remarque wrote that in All Quiet on the Western Front. I read it when I was young. At the time, I thought it was poetic. Now I simply know it's true. This work, writing what wounds us, is older than theory. Long before the word trauma existed, people told stories to give shape to loss. The Iliad holds a single rage and stretches it across a continent of grief. Achilles' wound becomes the weather the army marches in. Every death echoes inside it. The poem repeats because grief does too. Even the similes pause the killing to name the world. Birds, storms, a tree in spring. Naming these things is a way of insisting the world still exists, that it's still worth being named. Without that, too much disappears, not only people, but the shape of what they loved as well. Modern war shattered old containers, the scale changed, and so did the language. Sentences that once moved smoothly began to stammer. Meaning broke under pressure. April is the cruelest month, Eliot wrote in The Wasteland, and if you have lived through a spring after loss, you understand why. Remarque gave us boys turned old before they had a chance to live, and the knowledge that the real reckoning begins only after the guns fall silent. On the page, the sentences didn't line up anymore. They break apart, scattered like belongings after a hurried escape. A moment here, a sound there, scenes out of order. I've seen that kind of scattering, I've lived it. And I see it now in the work of others, like the Ukrainian poet Yulia Musakovska, who writes, "The metaphors withered and fell to pieces before they could bloom. The metaphors are buried in children's playgrounds." I believe an artist is also a moral witness. As such, they begin by looking long enough for the bruise to show and speaking plainly when it does. This keeps faith with the dead by naming them and serves the living by making a record that cannot be rewritten. It also means refusing the heroic gloss when facts say otherwise, and refusing revenge dressed as justice. Later, I learned there were names for what literature already knew. Kathy Caruth calls trauma the story of a wound that cries out. Refusal is the listening that does not turn away. I return to the cry until it is heard without being tided. I do not translate pain into something noble. I let it stand as it is, and I keep it from being traded for a cleaner tale. Sometimes the cry is late, and sometimes it's quite stubborn. When I write, I keep a record of what keeps coming back and leave room for what stays silent. The wound speaks in the body first, in sleep, in routes chosen, in what I avoid and what I carry without noticing. Only later does it reach the page. Even though some stories never leave you. Gazment Brlaioli, an Albanian linguist and translator, gathered testimonies of raped Albanian women during the war by Serbian forces. 20,000 women were raped. One of those stories became this poem. This is not the whole poem, just excerpts. It's titled Blackbirds. I don't know if I'm alive anymore. Everything in me was murdered. My mother witnessed savages dumping their filthy seed inside me for 21 days in a row. Her voice is the only one I hear, crying out my name like the call to a prayer whenever I get near the well. 9 times I tried to take my life, but death has many doors. In the land of rotted roots, rotted are the living. I don't want to take my life anymore. A sip of water is what I want. The war has changed me before it changed my writing. I sleep on the side of the bed closest to the door because I like the exit nearby. Keys sit in a bowl so I can find in the dark. In cafes, I take the seat with my back to the wall. I clock exits without thinking. Sirens startle me, fireworks too. My phone battery must always be above 40%. I text when I arrive and when I leave. When people speak, I watch their hands. These habits exist whether I write or not. The poems follow them. My craft is not an aesthetic choice alone. It is what remains of a life reorganized by fear. If the lines are lean, it's because the person who writes them has learned to carry only what can be carried and to set the rest down. I let verbs work and let adjectives rest. On hard days, I write what the hand can hold. Salt, onions, potatoes, a small list steadies me. I want the poem to keep a human measure. A kitchen table, a cup cooling, 2 people trying to say what cannot yet be said. My son was born after the war. He knows it happened in the way children know what their parents don't say. I haven't told him much, not the details. But something of it lives in our house anyway. And though he has never lived through war, he lives with someone who did, and it leaves a trace. He checks his phone battery before leaving the house. He double-checks that his ID is in the same pocket. He texts me when he arrives, and yet again when he's on his way back. I used to say thank you. Now I say, you don't have to do that every time. He says, I know, and still does it. I don't know if I'm protecting him or passing it on. Maybe both. Maybe that's what survival looks like. In Kosovo, shops open, children walk to school, neighbors argue about football and politics. The past still shows up, just in other corners. A knock after 10 at night means everyone goes quiet for a moment. A pause falls on certain names. At borders, we over-prepare passport, printed copies, even digital copies. We work and celebrate and make a lot of jokes, but the heart remembers that home is not a guaranteed sanctuary. We say our full names less than other people do and always put documents back in the same folder. We leave early for everything, just in case. Even good news makes us cautious. Joy is always followed by a glance over the shoulder. That's how it is across the whole region. Someone once said that Balkans make more history than it can consume, and sadly, it feels true. History here does not stay buried. Each country carries its own ghosts, and the borders hum with old grudges. In a supermarket in Germany, I stopped at a small aisle labeled Balkan products. 3 shelves gathered countries that could not be good neighbors at home, and this is an understatement, countries that tried to kill each other for centuries. I stood there with the cart. Behind each label, I could feel a story in a country trying to exist. That image refused to leave me, and it became this poem. Balkan products. Look at us, exiled and shelved, side by side on a supermarket shelf, simmering with unshed blood, no longer armed to kill or first claim to the ruins. Pride bleached out. Nationalism vacuum sealed. We're barcoded under one name, Balkan products. But the Balkans' finest export is flesh. Bright minds, white coats, steel nerves, vacuum sealed and shipped abroad. Our bodies, ground by wars, rebranded by diplomats as conflicts or tensions. And when exile aches like hunger, we search the supermarket aisle for something labeled home. I write because I don't want things to disappear. Erasure came long before my own grief. It touched our names, our history, even our mother tongue. It tried to rewrite even silence, but the page is where I draw a line. We Albanians have witnessed enough to know the cost of forgetting. That's why I try to be careful with words, to name things honestly so the wound doesn't get covered up and called something else. Writing doesn't close the wound or heal it, but it keeps it from being misnamed. And if a reader years from now recognizes the stone that wakes and knows it is as human, not only mine, then the page has done its work. And this is the ground I write from. Thank you.
Hello. Yeah, this sounds like a pity party already. It's depressing, but that is not the objective, I'll show you. Writing between scars and songs. I've often reached for the word beautiful to describe both Nigeria, my country, and Jos, the city of my birth in central Nigeria, which has remained central to my creative peregrinations over the years. But lately, I wonder if that adjective has been too soft and too forgiving. My country is not beautiful in the gentle sense of the word. It is handsome, rugged, angular, and scarred, with features so sharp they can wound. Its face bears the marks of conflict and fault lines etched by decades of incendiary ethnic, religious, and political strife. Yet, in those same lines lies its paradox, a place where violence and celebration, trauma and resilience, grief and laughter live side by side and regularly find expression. The first time I saw this violence up close was in September 2001, when Jos erupted and neighbors turned against neighbors for speaking different tongues or calling God by different names. That fire has flared and reflared across Nigeria ever since, through Boko Haram's terror, banditry, and separatist agitations in different corners of the country. We live in a nation not technically at war, but in an extended state of animus, with only fragile respite in between. It is no surprise that newspaper headlines are often about violence, death, and killings. But our story is not just about violence and mass trauma. In spite of it, every weekend in Nigeria is a celebration. Our weddings are riotous with colors and quite the sight to behold. If you haven't attended a Nigerian wedding or party, you must do yourself the favor of adding that to your bucket list. Our music is often not about sorrow and loss. It is about vibes and rhythm. Afrobeat thrives not on tragedy, but on tempo, its power measured in how quickly it moves bodies. It is hard to reconcile this joy with the headlines of violence, yet both are true. It does not detract from the fact that most Nigerians have experienced mass trauma and have varying degrees of mass PTSD, which we rarely acknowledge. Because our cultures do not have the mechanism to deal with this phenomenon, we do not have the language to address it. But as a writer and journalist, I have always interrogated this uncommon union of beauty, or rather rugged handsomeness, pain, and our joie de vivre disposition, and found myself grappling with the question, what do we do with this pain that we are so reluctant to acknowledge? I am not the first writer to wrestle with this question or these themes. A few years ago, there was a proliferation of what was termed poverty porn, emerging from the African literary space. This narrative, or narrative strand, centers on the misery of victims of conflicts, usually situates them in refugee camps, strips them of all dignity, details their hunger, pain, and suffering, and often ends with the victims escaping to the bright lights of the West. It comes from a Western journalistic tradition of presenting Africa as a continent of misery and want. The literary trend inspired the late Kenyan writer Binyavanga Wainaina to pen his widely acclaimed satirical essay, How to Write About Africa, in 2005. I have learned from my South American friends that this is not an exclusively African conundrum, as they too have what is called pornomiseria, or misery porn, derived from the cinematic traditions of the region in the 1970s. I have since come to understand that there have been two main approaches to addressing trauma in writing. The first is to overindulge in it by putting trauma and misery on full blast. This inadvertently ends up re-traumatizing the reader or afflicting them with secondary trauma. The other is to ignore it completely in favor of an escapist focus on opulence and blitheness. I confess that escapist literature is valid and is sometimes essential to retaining our sanity. Often, those who want to avoid secondary trauma avoid books they feel might infect them with misery. Others have asked of the literature of blitheness, how does this address our social reality? My approach as a writer, as someone who has witnessed and been directly affected by this violence and had to pick the remains of my life or the remnants of my life from ruins and cinders, is to find a balance, to chart a nuanced way of acknowledging the reality of living and aspiring to thrive with trauma and in spite of it, to depict how we are able to retain our smiles while standing in a field of loss or talking about the things we have lost, to portray our superpower, to weave dreams and joys from the ashes of our torched lives, to show how we are not just products of our environment, but how we decide to shape our environment and our narratives. My creative work is devoted to finding the right language to create a mirror that reflects us in the way we are, with all our contradictions and foibles, and to preserve this image for future generations, to know not to define us by the tragedies and misfortunes that have befallen us, captured in sensationalized newspaper headlines, so they grasp the subtleties that shaped how we found our voices and laughter, and danced, and lived, and loved. It is also a way to acknowledge our trauma, for pains and injustices left unacknowledged fester, without being overwhelmed by them. I continue to strive to deconstruct our realities and reshape them in ways that make sense to us, wrapping our pains and agony in dollops of flavored words so they are easier to swallow, so they don't choke us and inflict further violence on us. This manifests in the character of Yerima Lalo in my novel When We Were Fireflies, who suddenly realizes that he had lived twice before and twice had been murdered for love, and now fears that if he loves again, the same fate awaits him. As I furiously wrote that novel under the compulsion of the muse, I was aware that Yerima Lalo was not just a character. He is my country. This country that lives for love and yet suffers for hate, which has been subjected to cyclical violence but continues to rise for the love of love and the love of life, as my compatriots and I do every day. At first, he is overwhelmed by the recollection of all this trauma from his past lives and must embark on a journey to follow the threads so he could thrive in spite of it. He is a painter, and the importance of art and colors in his processing of this trauma is a reflection of the vibrant way that Nigerians use language, comedy, and laughter to process mass PTSD. This is also demonstrated in the symbolism of the beautiful flame trees in my novel Season of Crimson Blossoms, where my characters navigate their joys and desires despite the darkness they come from. Here, a victim of mass trauma, the main character, Hajia Binta, who lost her husband in the senseless violence in Jos, gets into an entanglement with a disreputable political thug who is 30 years her junior, with all the complexities and societal pressures that introduces in a conservative, close-knit community. Her traumatized niece, Faiza, manifests PTSD and is misunderstood, and she too finds expression and meaning in art, in something beautiful. It is no coincidence that all these characters choose to extract beauty from the horrors that they have passed through. I guess that is a reflection of me in my characters. Our histories are burdens we bear that cannot be altered, but our present and futures are still fair game. We have a choice of how tomorrow comes to know us and remember us. We have chosen to be seen with our flaws and foibles, but also in our finery. For what mass trauma does to us is rob us of our lives, our loved ones, our possessions, and our dignity. To write our story is to write about contradictions, wounds and weddings, sorrow and songs, trauma and survival. We are a people scarred by violence, yet unwilling to surrender joy. My duty as a writer is not to deny our pain, nor to be imprisoned by it, but to find the language that reflects us sincerely, our grief, our resilience, our laughter, and the contradictions that embody our experiences. For trauma and violence robs us of dignity, literature must restore it. That is why, even when my characters love recklessly or stumble through loss, they retain their humanity. Because we are not merely the trauma inflicted on us, we are more. Rugged, scarred, radiant, and still dancing. Thank you.
What an amazing set of presentations. I look forward to hearing your questions and comments. And while you ready those thoughts in your mind, I'll tell you about some upcoming events. This Sunday at 4 p.m., we will have an IWP reading at Prairie Lights featuring Roy Horowitz from Israel and Andra Schwartz from Germany. Join us on Thursday, September 11th at 7:30 p.m. in the Theater Building for Global Express. You Iowa actors will perform a staged reading of selected works by IWP writers in residence. Next Friday, we will have a doubleheader, beginning with another Iowa City Public Library panel at noon, where the topic will be At Home in the World, featuring Agnes Chu from Singapore, Siddharth Das Gupta from India, and Raja Asnaya from Saudi Arabia. They will present. And that evening, September 12th at 5 p.m., we will host a reading at the Shamba House at 430 North Clinton, featuring Abu Bakar from Nigeria and Wang Ching Hung from Hong Kong and Scotland. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
I sincerely hope we haven't traumatized all of you.
I sense with each of you that there's something in the midst of all this you're not willing to let go of. I guess if you had to put that into one word, what would it be?
I don't think I understand the question. I do a bit. Could you repeat your question, please?
Yes, if you had to put into one word what it is that you're not willing to let go of.
I believe that some experiences, some images, somehow they choose to remain silent, and it's quite difficult to put them into one word. I think that when the time comes, because the writer, as a witness in this case, has to be ready for certain images to be translated into page, whether poetry or prose or journalism. And maybe we're not there yet.
I think for me, one word would be nostalgia. Because I remember what?
Can you repeat that?
Nostalgia, that is the word for me. You know, this remembrance of the days of innocence before, I mean, things have sort of been shit, more or less, right? But, you know, growing up, you kind of remember these days where you could walk into your neighbor's house and, or you're walking past and they invite you to join them for meals and things like that. And suddenly all of that is fractured because of the intervention of politics, ethnicity, or religion and all of that. And, you know, losing that for me would be the greater tragedy, you know, because I know the sense of it. I know what it means to have had that. And I just feel sorry for the generations that have come after me that have never experienced that, and all they've known is strife and conflict and hatred. So for me, it's important to kind of capture that and not lose it.
We've never had that in Kosovo, so I'm not nostalgic.
What you've shared with us today has been a gift to us. It's been so valuable for us to hear, and your writing it and sharing it has been a gift. But I want to believe that in writing these pieces, which I imagine you did over the last week, if you found that writing them was a tool for you as well to process, and if writing these were a gift for you.
Good question.
Me personally, I wouldn't really call it a gift. It was quite difficult going back and thinking about all that, because I wasn't even ready for Julia's essay. It moved me emotionally very much. But, and I don't believe that writing has that therapeutic effect that people claim. I believe that when it is shared, I guess the burden lessens a tiny bit, but it's not that you like heal yourself. So for me, it was quite difficult. It's not easy. Maybe others have better experiences.
Well, I was procrastinating, so it took me 3 days, and my problem oftentimes is trying to fit so much into the word count, and also with the timing, limited timing at events, you feel like you need to tell the entire history of your country, which has been invisible for so long.
and the view on which has been shaped so much by the colonial past and Russia's prerogative in many ways to speak and be present. So yeah, there was a lot I wanted to tell, but of course it's not healing, but it makes you understand certain things. Writing makes you comprehend the unthinkable. So I also thought I was going to write about certain things, but the text carried me elsewhere. And as a poet, you know, I often go with the flow because at the end I see why it does that to me. And here it was not only important to talk about our present day trauma, but also to take out all of these layers before and to understand how you know, the initial conditions looked like for us. So it's much more than what started in 2022, even in 2014, where the war really started, but also these decades and centuries of oppression. But in a way, it also helps me realize how resilient my people are. And those generations, the previous generations who were not ready to confront their trauma, who were afraid that this, not just the knowledge, but also some people, because of that knowledge, may hurt their kids, their grandkids. They still were, in their way, very resilient. And we are learning to be resilient in our own way, but also that resilient is plays against us in many ways, because Ukraine is kind of seen as this very resilient state, and those people who are superheroes, and they can withstand that huge mass of Russia. Because when you look at the map, it's David versus Goliath fight. And we're holding on, and we're also dancing and having weddings and trying to find joy, but it doesn't mean that we are invincible. And also in recently we are feeling more and more alone. And it's hard to find words to express that.
I guess for me it's like Laura, I don't think it was a gift. But it's always been the guiding philosophy of my writing and my journalism as well, you know, to kind of interrogate how this history of violence and all of it kind of defines who we are as a people, but then at the same time not kind of be defined by it in the sense that that is all people remember about us. For me, that has always been paramount. But the opportunity to kind of write this just meant that I had to dive into it all over again and articulate my thoughts exactly about my understanding of what we do with the trauma that we have in writing and in literature. I just feel like when you have to engage with this, too often it becomes so depressing. And as I said, my countrymen are very resilient. And when I say my countrymen, I mean the men and the women, right? We're like super resilient, but sometimes I wonder, when you have this constant bombardment of violence, sometimes from the people who are your neighbors or who are next door to you, sometimes from your government, sometimes from, you know, those who are supposed to be protecting you. How long would this resilience of yours last? When is it going to break? Right? And every time you think, oh, wow, it's too much, it is going to crack now, something happens that makes you kind of, you know, renew your faith in people and in your country. But at the back of your mind, there's always that question, when, you know. So this essay sort of made me think about that some more, and it is not a good feeling. And I know that because I'm a very immersive writer, I kind of live the experiences that I'm writing whenever I'm writing them. And when I do, I just disengage mentally so that I kind of clean up my mind and my psyche and be the person that I am. So this kind of took me back there for some reason. And yeah, but we'll see. We're optimistic. We'll continue dancing as long as we can.
Hello. My question is how you record trauma without contributing towards nationalism. I don't know much about the history of Nigeria, but as a foreigner, I think of the Balkans, I think of various cycles of fear and vengeance. Mr. Milosevic used trauma of a cruel Croatian leader attacking Serb minorities during World War II, and I guess Kosovo was partially inspired by some Muslim battle victory 700 years previously. No? Well, I heard something. I'm not saying the expert, but and even in Russia, that was partially inspired by fears of repeated invasions from the West. So, how do you write about trauma without inspiring nationalism and revenge from future generations?
Milosevic was also known as the butcher of the Balkans. He started his war with first Slovenia, then Croatia, then Bosnia, then Kosovo. Luckily, Macedonia and Montenegro could get their independence without wars because Milosevic was at the time in the Hague Tribunal. What happened, now if we go back to history, Kosovo was part of Albania, and after the Ottoman rule was dissolved, our national hero, Skanderbeg, who is also now known as George Kastrioti, he fought the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century, and he was even called the protector of Christianity because he and his army were the ones who stopped the Ottoman Empire from expanding into the Vatican and the upper part of Europe. In 1919, after the First World War, when the great powers gathered in the Paris Peace Conference, Albanian lands were divided. Kosovo was, because at that time Albania wasn't as organized, and a lot of international powers were there, occupying parts of it, like Greece, Italy, French. There was even an idea to destroy Albania as a state and just divide the lands among other European states. However, President Wilson, American president, was there, and he was the one that saved Albania because he believed in self-determination and existence of nations. And at that time, Kosovo was given to what was known the Serbian kingdom. But even for 100 years, the Serbs couldn't really, couldn't extinguish our language or our history, even though they tried very hard. Now, I know that sounds nationalistic, but if you look at the statistics, Kosovo was always inhabited by Albanians, more than 93–94%. And when someone tries to erase you, practically erase your language, your history, your culture, your music, everything, of course you're not going to just stand by. We stood by for a long time, like 100 years. And when I write, now to go back to your question, I just felt I had to give some details, historical context. To go back to your question, we were the victims. And we got our freedom thanks to the international interventions led by the United States mostly. I do not put ornaments. I do not use words. I'm very careful. I try to distance myself as much as I can, but I do not write slogans which incite like nationalistic pride. I have my short book of stories, which I published just recently before coming here, and I have there stories about members of our liberation army who didn't really fight who got the hero's glows, because war also produces these kind of figures, fake heroes. And I think that we as writers should also record that and be careful with the words, not to incite and not to feed into nationalistic discourse, because we are the ones who have witnessed what a nationalistic discourse does, what it did to Serbia, and what it's still doing. There are still protests all over the country. This is it from me. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. I just want to make sure that I heard you correctly. Was it something about Russia's fear for invasion from the West? I think you need to diversify your sources of information, and it looks like the sources you've been reading is Russian propaganda, because now if you look at the story, this myth that Russia was afraid of Ukraine joining NATO. Ukraine's initiative of joining NATO only began after Russia's invasion of the Lugansk and Donetsk regions and occupation of Crimea. Before that, Ukrainian people didn't care for NATO. And also, you know that Russia has now Finland and Sweden as new members of NATO, which were inspired, so to say, by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And so it's clearly not the reason. These fears, this is complete misinformation. And as to nationalism, there's this idea of Ukrainian nationalism has been disseminated by the Soviets, even in the Soviet Union, because they were so afraid of Ukrainians realizing their identity and owning their identity and developing their culture. This has also, being a Ukrainian patriot, writing in Ukrainian and being working for your own country and putting your country's interests first, it was nationalism. But it's clearly not. It is patriotism. You can't be an American patriot, but for some reason you cannot be a Ukrainian patriot. You will be called a nationalist. So this is, I think, it's going to the terms and realizing what these terms really mean. But thank you for your question.